Today we're talking about Expressionism in Central Europe in the period before the First World War. And this is actually the fourth in this series on early 20th century modernism, which is my area of expertise. A lot of people, because I did the Renaissance series here, mistakenly thought that that was my expertise. And although I love the Italian Renaissance, I think early 20th century modernism and the Italian Renaissance are the two high points of Western civilization as far as visual art is concerned. So, but one of the problems is, of course, modern art is still inaccessible to a lot of people. They don't get it, or they believe it's that modern artists were charlatans or whatever. And far from that, modern artists were really very critical of the rising, especially of fascism and totalitarianism in Germany and Central Europe. So I put on as emblematic this very well-known piece from 1899, a beautiful close to the century or opening to the horrors of our century. It's by Edvard Munch, and it's called The Scream. And although it was painted before the Expressionists really began, he is kind of one of the roots, one of the main sources of Expressionism. Now, we used to think that 20th century art was utterly different than 19th century art. We saw that schism between the two, but the farther we get away from that into the 21st century, the more we see there's a really an organic unity between the aspirations of the 19th century and those of the 20th century, which I think in a way are almost similar to the early and the high Renaissance, right? It kind of kicks it up into a higher gear. And this first generation, brilliant generation, that experimented before the opening of the First World War in 1914 were as different as their work looked. It had roots in the post-impressionist generation of just before. So Gauguin's post-impressionist work with its fanciful colors and its flat composition and its beautiful harmonies engendered in the next generation Matisse and the Fauvists, who took the curvilinear forms, the beautifully harmonious colors, and turned it all up. Or as the chef on the TV says, is kicked it up a notch. And that's exactly what's happening. I think you can see here clearly where he takes that as his point of departure. But it's not a conservative point of departure. It's really a radical leap. And we'd already looked at Matisse. We also looked at Picasso and Braque. And we saw how their work was very rooted in the post-impressionist Paul Cézanne, the master of form. And we saw that in Cubism, and we see that also in Russian art and in Italian art. We looked at Futurism. It all comes from this language of form that's very geometric and flowing and fills up kind of the surface of the painting. But the Expressionists, their point of departure was Vincent van Gogh. And the thing is that Van Gogh was not well known at all. His work, his brother's wife had kept all his work, so his work was intact as well as the letters and all that sort of stuff. But it wasn't until 1907 that an art historian called Meyer Grafe put him on the map and had a huge show, the Sonderburn show in 1910, I believe. And I'm sorry, 1907, I'm sorry, I get my days mixed up, of the Sonderburn exhibition. And that was a huge expose now of Van Gogh's work. And Van Gogh was very, very prolific. Although he died very early, in the mid-30s, there's a whole museum full of his work in Amsterdam. And that's not all of it. So he's a very, very prolific artist. But what I think the artists of Central Europe really saw in Van Gogh was the psychological dimension. It wasn't really about beautiful, harmonious colors. It wasn't about form and shape. It was about expression of the soul. And this kind of stuff really appealed to the artists, especially of Germany and Austria and Switzerland, because there's a kind of a mystical element in German art that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And of course, Van Gogh gives rise to German Expressionism. And this is Egon Schille's portrait of Paris von Güstrow, in which the artist is kind of portrayed as a madman or a genius. And the line is very thin between them. I want to call attention especially to the beautiful linear quality of the expressionist piece and the intense stare. Those eyes and those hands are electric, really like electric. They're agitated. They are the instruments through which the spirit moves and uses the body of the artist and the mind of the artist and the soul of the artist as a vessel, right? And these mystical terms are very much how, especially Vasily Kandinsky, one of the leaders of the German Expressionists, although he was Russian, in his groundbreaking book concerning the spiritual in art from 1911. The difficult thing in this lecture is I love the stuff so much, it's hard to winnow it down to an hour. So I'll try my best to stay within the hour, but it's very exciting and very tragic as well as mystical work. Now, Edvard Munch, we're all familiar with the scream, the cry, and Munch was associated with a movement called symbolism in the late 19th century. Here's another one of his paintings, and Munch, just as much as Van Gogh, was an inspiration to the German Expressionists. In fact, he exhibited with them sometimes because he lived up until the 30s. But he was really doing it before. And this is called the Dance of Life. And here is very haunted. It's this woman. She's early in life. On the left, there are spring flowers. She's dressed in white. In the center, she dances a sort of a strange mystification. And then on the right, finally, she's a widow and she's alone. And in the background, it's maybe not clear unless you're used to it, is that there's a horizon there and then the moon has just risen over the lake or the sea. And it has this kind of timeless and tragic quality. Although it is similar to Fauvish, and we looked at Matisse, and we looked at Derain, we looked at those guys, and they also do distort forms. They distort them in curvilinear ways. They flatten out the picture plane. They intensify the saturation of colors. But in Expressionism, it's done not to be a comfortable armchair. Matisse says art should be a comfortable armchair. That in our harried life, with all the honking horns and the pressures of and everything, art should be like a comfortable armchair. We should be able to just take rest in it. It should be a balm. It should be a salve for us. And it's very French that they saw it in the very positive sort of terms. And his work, for the most part, is bright and radiant, and the colors are harmonious, even though they're very strong. And even the primitivism that he has gives him a beast-like character, a raw kind of untrained quality. I mean, he was anything but. But that was all dedicated to making us feel good. And it really is almost like a drug, right? And Matisse, when you get one of his lovely paintings and you're in front of it, you do just feel the deliciousness of life. But the Germans and the Scandinavians were much more concerned with the darker aspects of life, the disappointments, the alienation of modern man and modern woman. And instead of using art to cover up that alienation or to be a balm or a salve or an escape, it just dived right into alienation, jealousy, these darker emotions. And remember, this was also the time when Sigmund Freud was publishing his groundbreaking work. And he postulated there was this id, which in German just it means it. We translate ego and it. It's just the S and the it. It's the I and the it, because it feels so foreign to us. But it's those instinctual things, those emotions that rise from the kind of brainstem, I guess. And he was painting a picture of human existence as not the sort of rosy colored thing of the Victorian era, but of kind of this dark place that was secretive and sexually frustrated and just about to explode in any minute. And I think this whole thing, the way it addresses the dance of life, so unlike Matisse's La Danse, I should have brought that anyway, they're just dancing around joyfully. Here, there's this darker quality. There's a sense of fate. There's a sense of alienation. There's a sense of dissatisfaction. There's even kind of when you see the second couple over here dancing, there's almost a lustful kind of quality to it. So it's like he brings out, instead of covering them up, he brings out these darker aspects. Here's one of my favorites. It's Self-Portrait in Hell. It says everything. He just, I guess, envisions himself as possibly being there, or even during his own life, the hell that his life kind of became. He was very afflicted with alcoholism, and he had to really struggle with that all of his life. But he also struggled with depression and kind of used the alcohol as a means of escape. And so he led a tragic life as well, and cast himself in hell is just kind of a strange, macabre, but very, very Munch kind of a thing to do, to emphasize that sense of human alienation in the face of a mechanized universe. But the Germans were more positive, and they were more willing to take on the new language of form that was being pioneered in Paris. And there was a group from Dresden, in Germany, because it only became a nation in 1870. It was Bavaria and Prussia and Austria and all these different things. It never developed an artistic center on the level of Paris, for the French, which was really an international kind of center. So in Germany, in the first decades, what we see is a group of expressionists in Dresden, another group in Munich, and another group in Vienna. And we'll kind of look at each of these groups in turn. The first group called themselves Die Brücke, or the bridge, because they felt that they wanted to bridge between all of the arts and technology and society. So that's the sense that they came up with. The four guys that founded, this is kind of a self-portrait of them, and Kirchner's in the very center, who's kind of the leader of the group. They were all in their 20s, and they were all architecture students, but they became very fascinated with symbolist work and with the work, once it was shown in Dresden, of Matisse and of the Fauves, and wanted to launch a similar kind of movement inspired by that, but more intellectual and less sensuous, more serious kind of on the thing. And I think it shows in this depiction of them as well. The German expressionists, and this goes back before Expressionism, Germans were always very much into the graphic arts and woodcuts from the Middle Ages and from Dürer and so forth. This goes way back. And the Expressionists took up on that, and they worked with, and this is a woodcut, and this was a exhibition poster. Their first show was actually in a light, like a chandelier place, a display place for lamps and chandeliers, and one of them, through his architecture teacher, had come in contact with this, and they had their opening show there in the light store. But it was a sensation, and critics came, and they said some good things and some bad things. So let's look at the bridge group and kind of find our way around. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner is really the main artist in the group. And he kind of the spokesman for the group. And here's the self-portrait in this long kind of robe. And he has, I guess it's a model in the background. And he shows himself with the paint brushes and so forth. But that mask-like face, but it still resembles him. So it's a good likeness. But I wanted to call your attention to the clash of the colors. This is not Matisse, where everything is harmonious and beautiful. These are colors like that blue and that orange that really kind of struggle. They really have a dissonant sound. rather than a harmonious sound. And I think he wants to bring out these dissonances of modern life and give them expression. And that's what he's doing here. And he's also kind of showing his lifestyle, kind of a looser sexuality than most of uptight Dresden bourgeois society. They were young people. There was, so he shows himself nude with just this robe on, with this very confrontational thing. He also shows some streetwalkers in the red light district, and they're all dressed up in Dresden. And notice how he uses these spiky forms and these dark colors, and an acidic, I guess that's a word, dissonant or acidic sort of relationships between colors. Colors that almost make you a little sick, almost, right? Sometimes they're more conventional, and he does also landscapes like this beautiful picture of Dresden. And of course, Dresden, was carpet bombed during the Second World War, but it was a beautiful Baroque city in the early 20th century, and there's the cathedral. But notice how he shifts the colors, and here the colors are much more harmonious, but the greens and the purples and kind of suggesting the end of the day and the twilight, that kind of pink thing of the sun, but yet exaggerating the colors. So you never think that it was trying to be a realistic rendition. Instead, it's an interpretive rendition. Now, this stuff looked much more shocking when it was produced in 1907 and 1908 than it does now. It's kind of almost hard for us to believe that something like this could have aroused the kind of ire that it did, but there were people in the art establishment that really disliked the modernists. And so the modernists were always kind of the kooks on the edge of the discourse. Until Hitler, by banning them and persecuting them, kind of made them into heroes. And it had the opposite effect. What we find is modern art, when all these artists come over from the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and Vichy France and fascist Spain and Italy, they come to America and the center of the art world moves with them. And that post-war generation, these guys, no longer kind of the eccentrics on the margins, are seen as the freedom fighters who stood up to the dictators, and in the meantime developed a whole new language of form that wasn't so wed to photographic likeness or realism, but tried rather to show the interior reality. And I think that's very much, that psychological dimension is very much a part of German Expressionism. There was a big movement of nudist colonies. And Kirchner and some of the other Dresden group used to sometimes take their girlfriends and go for the weekend or the week to stay in these nudist colonies, which were kind of part of this cult of nature. The Germans had this whole thing, that the youth hostels, that young people, you could go any place you go, you can get a very reasonably priced room. You have to cook your own food and stuff, but it's a good sort of thing. And that started right here as the Wandervogel movement. So, and of course, this appealed to their anti-establishment. Here's a beautiful picture of this cat, a woodcut, print. I just thought it was lovely, and it's graphic quality and the strength of it and the boldness of design. He does get drafted, and he hates the war. And this is one of the pictures he painted during the war of people in the shower. It's kind of creepy in a way, given that the Nazis later, gassed people under their guise of showers. This is not what this is. The commanding officer watching, I don't know why he's watching, is kind of strange. And they have it's a very strange kind of painting. It's a strange, he does others of nudist colonies as well. Here's a strange picture that he does during the war. He imagines that he's had his right hand cut off. And I think it was based on a dream that he had. And of course that would, inhibit your ability to be an artist. And he shows himself with a very tough visage with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. It's a very, he's a very sensitive soul. That the First World War was a terrible experience for him, and he, really suffered. And he also dealt with depression all his life, and actually ended his life during the Nazi regime, hounded sort of out of his job and out of everything. This is one of his later paintings. And I think this is interesting that it's the interior of his studio, but the space is so kind of confusing. I can't quite tell, it's as if it's distorted, as if it's almost like, how you'd experience it on drugs or maybe in depression. Right. So that's the, the stories of these people are not happy stories or anything like that. They're very tragic and mystical, as I said, the tragic and mystical work of German expressionists. Max Pechstein is another one of these guys, and he really had, I think, of the expressionists, he was the most embraced by the public, and he was the most received, although his work is not as radical as his fellow expressionists. But he does absolutely beautifully lovely paintings. Again, the nude figure out in nature, and not as a goddess, not as Venus or anything, but as in a nudist colony in a tent. Very, 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 very lovely. But again, the colors, they're not pinks. They're not. There's a seriousness to it. There's this darker quality. Sometimes, however, he's just radiant. And I think this one is just absolutely beautiful, just like little light shimmering through crystals or something like that. This female nude by the sea with this wonderful sky. The whole idea of nature as an embodiment of the divine can be traced back in German culture to 19th century Romanticism. And Novalis, one of the poets of Romanticism, said that blue was the color of spirituality because it seems to recede. It seems to go back and into the depths. And by the way, there were a number of theorists, Wilhelm Wöhringer, who wrote Empathy and Form during this time, and then 1907, 1909, before the war, which talked about expression and empathy and how the artist and throughout history, Germanic kind of artists have tried to give form to their inner struggle, right? Their inner demons. And he also wrote a book called Form and Gothic, where he said that the spiky forms of Gothic were a northern sort of response to the southern, Italian embracement of the classical, that it had a spookier, more romantic, Gothic sort of thing. Emil Nolde is I hate to say everyone is my favorite, but Emil Nolde is really an interesting case because he's older than the rest of them. And they see his work. He develops expressionism entirely on his own with these beautiful expressionistic landscapes, some of them in watercolor, some of them in oil paint. He exaggerates the color, and his paint application is very thick, very pasty kind of paint that give it a rough and raw quality. But his colors are beautiful and harmonious. And Emil Nolde is a real, he's a conservative, and he was from, he was educated in Denmark, but they run into his work, and he starts exhibiting with them. They're all in their 20s. He's in his 40s. So he's like 12 years older than Picasso. So he's really kind of a grandfather kind of figure. But I mean, he's full blown, and his work is just as fresh, and it's more mature, I think, than the other artists. Look at this, and the Germans have always done this kind of mystical attitude toward nature, that nature is not just pretty or picturesque, but it's an expression of the sublime. It's an embodiment of God's presence, kind of a thing. So it has this mystical, the thing idea of the landscape being a place that we inhabit, not so much with our bodies as with our souls, right? And these churning colors and this radiant light. It always seems that in Nolde's work, we're on the point of revelation. His work just moves with me so deeply. These landscapes. Here's a woodcut, print and this is incredible. This is the prophet, and he doesn't say which prophet it is, but I always think of Jeremiah, who was in the Old Testament always not listened to as he was proclaiming prophecies. And this, of course, is a woodcut as well. And I think by giving it a generic name of just the prophet, it makes it more universal, because it doesn't even have to particularly be, the Bible. A prophet could be from kind of any culture. And I think that Emil Nolde also thought of himself as a prophet, that the Expressionists were kind of a voice crying in the wilderness, like the author of the Gospel says about John the Baptist, kind of a crazy man out on the fringes, preaching change and repentance. And I think, and Emil Nolde, among all these people, was very devoutly Protestant. And his religious convictions were very important. And he does a lot of subject matter. This is Adam and Eve, and I guess this is just the moment after Eve had taken the bite of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And she gets it. She sees there's death. We can defy. We don't have to do what God says, and so forth. Adam is has still not participated. He's still, but he's looking suspiciously at the whole thing. I think it captures the essence of the story beautifully. And I also want to point out his color, the way he pits colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel, like yellow and purple and here green, into these strange kind of color combinations that glow, that have this inner light that seem, you see what I'm saying, a radiant quality. It reminds me of Rembrandt in that sense. It has this kind of, they're lit from within, or they almost seem sometimes they stained glass windows, they have that kind of radiant quality. Here are the Hebrews dancing wildly before the golden calf in the story from the book of Exodus, where Moses leads them out from slavery and goes up to the mountain to talk to God. And what do? They revert to idolatry. And I think he thought of his own, I think he thought of the 20th century as kind of an idolatrous century. And he felt that it kind of needed a spiritual dimension. And this is something a lot of these people, he said that he's a Protestant, kind of a mystical Protestant though. And here's Christ blessing the children. And here's a crucifixion. It's part of a big polyptych that really rivals the medieval and Renaissance masterpieces like Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece. Very tragic. I mean, I think the language, that rough handling of form, the expressive distortion that goes on, the flatness of the whole thing adds to its pathos, makes it seem, I think this expressionistic style is really good for capturing despair, suffering, betrayal, those kinds of things. And it's a profoundly tragic painting, and very large. And then really my favorite by him, and one of my very favorite pieces of art history, and it's The Last Supper. And you'd think, Leonardo da Vinci does such a good job. Why would anyone even bother? But Emil Nolde picks a different point in the story. As you know, it was the last Passover before his murder, and by the Romans. And so they're having a Passover meal together, but he changes it, because after the blessing that follows the meal, he blessed the bread and the third cup of wine, he added another part about, this is the cup of my blood, of the eternal covenant of faith, the mystery of faith. This shall be shed for all for the forgiveness of sins. And so it's this mystical moment when he is uniting with God and becoming kind of this oneness with God, this mystical union. And you can see in the kind of grotesque face of Jesus, in a holy face, how he's just like a lantern that lightens the people that are all around him. He's having this transcendent moment of mystical union with the Father as he holds the cup of wine in his hands, and he fully understands that he will have to suffer death, and he is a human being. So he's in a difficult and sublime kind of last moment. And none of the other disciples understand that this is the Last Supper. They think it's just the opening of Passover. And they're mystified. They know something transformative and transcendental is happening in these actions and in these words of Jesus, but they don't understand it. They're mystified. And they look at one another and they look at Christ to see, like, what could this mean? What might this mean? This is my blood of the new covenant and faith, you know. The only one who isn't transfixed by these mystical words is Judas up here, who's the one who betrays Jesus. I can't get my arrow to work, but the second one, kind of large face with a beard and sneaky, beady eyes, figuring out when he can sneak off. And I love the color. When you see the actual painting, it's incredible because he uses black in such a way that it sets off the colors that they glow. He uses very bright underpainting and then glazes colors on top of it, and then sets it off with this black so that it has this radiant quality that you just know this is not a regular meal or even a regular Passover. It's this mystical moment of union. Okay, so I hope you like this stuff. I mean, I just, you know, and there's very few people who do Christian themes in the 20th century that are any good. You know, and he's really one of them. He really feels it deeply, and I feel that he's kind of one of these people like Rembrandt. He's on a very, very high level of transcendence and mysticism in his work. But okay, there's some interesting caveats here. This is called the Pharisees. Look at that yellow beard, how it illuminates the things. Are wonderful, you know. But of course, the Pharisees were the enemies of Jesus in the gospel stories. And here's the downside of Emil Nolde. Emil Nolde ended up, well, Emil Nolde was interested, like a lot of the early 20th century masters like Matisse and Picasso, in what at that time was called primitive art, that is art of village-based societies and royal kingdoms in places like Oceania. And Germany had New Guinea was a colony, and so he was sent on an expedition as the illustrator in just before the war, like 1913. And here's a picture of some of the people. He was fascinated by the whole thing. He does these masks of it, but he also does this crazy thing called the missionary. And he makes the missionary there, I guess, with his scroll into this monster. And the people from New Guinea, the woman and her child, seem really nice compared to that. So it's really interesting. Well, okay, here's the surprise. Emil Nolde ended up being a Nazi. And he wasn't just one of those opportunistic Germans that joined the party when Hitler seized power in 1933. He was a Nazi in 1922 at the very, very beginning. He was in on the first floor. And despite all his Christian mysticism and everything, but there's so many contradictions because he also made contributions to Zionist organizations in Palestine. He sent them money because he felt the Jewish people should have a homeland. So how do you reconcile Zionism and Nazism? It's very, very strange. And then, of course, the Nazis had a very low opinion of tribal people like people from New Guinea. And yet he sees the missionaries as the bad guys, as the monster, as the scary one, because I think he respects their religion and their sense of spirituality that he feels when he was meeting. He does other interesting illustrations. I brought this one in because I think it really showed the confusion of him. And of course, later on, although he became very successful in Weimar, Germany, and really quite respected as an older artist, when the Nazis get in, even though he had been with the party from the beginning, they ostracized him. And his big crucifixion was the centerpiece for the Degenerate Art Show of 1936. And they forbade him to practice art. So it was actually against the law to sell him brushes or paints or that kind of stuff. And the Nazis used to make surprise visits to his studio just to make sure that he wasn't painting, to his home and rifle through everything and stuff like that, right? I mean, these people were so against modern art. Who cares? Emil Nolde, you know, but it's just kind of amazing that, so he really learned his lesson. And he was a broken man and died not too many years after the end of the war. He did continue to do paintings, but very small paintings, those little tiny paintings. He calls them the unpainted paintings. And his friends would sneak him in a little watercolor. You know how watercolor can come in little cakes? You can get it in a tube, you can get little cakes, like, you know, at school. And they brought him these little cakes so he could hide them. And he had them hidden. He had paintings hidden in all these books in his library. Because he was afraid that, you know, if they found that he was painting, because he was forbidden to paint, not only just to exhibit, but to even paint, right? Just how mental they were. Just how, you know, it's very strange. So he's one of the great enigmas of the 20th century. And why I left the Nazi part to the end is because I wanted you to see him, you know, really the way he is. I think he's a deeply spiritual person, although, you know, he made some real bad moral choices and then repented kind of at the end. So he's kind of an interesting case, you know, as someone who was misled. And it was mostly, I think, idea of you know, law and order, you know, especially because a lot of people don't realize that Germany almost became communist right after the First World War. And Berlin was actually occupied by communist sailors. And we'll talk about that later. But he got from that, I think he got a very anti-communist thing. And of course, the communists are against religion. So he was kind of saw himself as the enemy of that. And that's how he got mixed up. Not he was so involved with Nazi world the way some of the architects were. But I mean, it's kind of pitiful that he did that, and he writes letters saying, "Well, you put me in the show. I'm a good German, and my work is, you know, that kind of stuff." Okay, so Emil Nolde is the enigma of the movement. But you know, I think the tragedy of his embracement of Nazism and then how they persecuted him later, and how he worked through these problems in his art, both spiritual and physical and economic and moral and everything else. So I think he's a very interesting, very complicated person. And I'm not quick to just judge him and dispose of him. He made some wrong choices. But that's, to me, what makes him particularly fascinating is the kind of, this is not just some ding-dong Nazi artist. This is a really complex, evolved sort of person who, so anyway, I find it just interesting on a moral level. Okay, well, I gotta speed this up. We're gonna go to Munich next, and there the group was more organized than the Dresden group, and they actually published a journal called The Blue Rider. And again, it's this Novalis idea of blue as being the most spiritual of colors. And the Blue Rider, the idea, do I have another picture of the Blue Rider here? This is the cover, and this is by Vasily Kandinsky. The leader of this group was a foreigner. He was a Russian, Vasily Kandinsky. And Kandinsky is famous because he came up with the first fully abstract art around 1910. That had no reference whatsoever to landscape or the figure or anything. As abstract as Picasso gets, or Matisse, or any of these other expressionists get, they never break through and use just pure color and pure form and try to realize things this way. And this is kind of a famous story that he'd been out with his buddies drinking or whatever. He came back to a studio, he turned on the lights, and there he saw this painting. And he just said, boy, this is wonderful. It's, you know, he didn't recognize it in the half light. And it wasn't until he kind of came closer that he realized it was one of his landscapes on its side. It was one of these expressionistic landscapes that Kandinsky was involved with. But this was seen as a turning point for him, because he realized that just these abstract forms, if you can try not to see the landscape and see it just as colors and forms, this was a revelation to him. This is like color and form and line and texture. These are expressive means, and they can express emotions directly. We don't have to have a storyline. We don't have to have it look like something. It can be just like kind of pure art. And he loved music. He liked how music can move the soul. And yet it isn't representational usually. Sometimes there's music and it portrays a babbling brook or chirping birds, but usually it doesn't. It just hits you and moves you. And he felt that that was a worthy kind of standard for art. Now that photography had been so developed by this time, even color photography, that the artist needed to move into another kind of a realm, and that everyone had been searching for, but here he kind of happens upon it as an accident. And then he begins consciously to do abstract work, and sometimes it's halfway. This one is another rider, and the rider is an interesting concept for them, and this is why they call themselves that, because the horse, Freud, in one of his essays on sexuality, 3 theories of sexuality, I think, he says the id is like the horse. It's like a horse, and the ego, the self, the id is the instincts, right? Sex and violence and all those kind of things, right? And the rider is like the ego, and he has to kind of tame the horse. The idea isn't to kill the horse, because then you don't have a horse, but to be able to use its energy and to do good, right? And so the ego is kind of the driver of this horse. But if you don't have the instinctual stuff there, then it's not as deep. It doesn't call forth a deeper diapason of his soul, right? And Kandinsky is the one who wrote Concerning the Spiritual in Art from 1911. I can, it's been translated in 1 million languages almost immediately. It's easy to get. It's one 2-hour session, you can read the whole thing. And basically what he says is that we have reached a crisis point in Western civilization, because science and technology, which we had first used to help us, now is kind of taking over. And we're becoming like machines. And at the same time, we're becoming very materialistic. And he felt this materialism, this insistence on physical things, on a very rationalist, very down to earth, very no hocus pocus kind of straight and narrow approach to things. He was against that. He wanted to let the soul go free. And what he felt was that I kind of lost my train of thought here. He said that given all of this mechanization, and this especially, there's so much science and technology itself, which is good if it's used well, but it's the moral immaturity of us to be able to handle it. And he felt the reason we couldn't is we've lost the spiritual dimension to our life. We've just let it dry up instead of using it as fuel to transform society for the better, right? So he sees the artist is not so much a master who creates as a vessel through which what he calls the spirit, and he leaves it very vague. He doesn't make it Christian necessarily, because he looks at Buddhism, he looks at theosophy, he's looking at a lot of different stuff. But that the spirit is what will save us from materialism. And yet we live in sort of a godless, materialistic society that the only thing that matters is money and production, and our life is being more and more machine-like. He felt that the last bastion of the spirit is the arts, that it had been exorcised from every place else almost, but in the arts, the spirit takes refuge. And that this is the great hope for mankind, is that through art, through the sublimation made possible by art, that we can transform our society from a barbaric place that's driven by materialism and a godless sort of looking after money and only money, instead of becoming more spiritual beings. So he felt that when the artist is really doing good work, he's just a medium. He's a mediumistic being. The spirit just kind of goes through him. And then even he makes a mistake or he drips paint or something like that, it's perfect, because the artist is a vessel. He's not the creator. He's Kandinsky said it's like the midwife the artist. It just has to kind of stand back and let the spirit materialize itself. So he comes up with this whole theory of art comes from the depths. He uses an idea of a tree, comes like the roots, the depths of the soul. And then it rises up and then gives form to art. And there's a certain resemblance between the branches of the tree and the roots. They kind of look similar, but they're not the same. And the trunk of the tree, that's the artist that draws on those deep things in the conscious and even in the collective unconscious and even in the realm of pure spirit, right? So he's a different kind of a mystic than Nolde was. Nolde was a Christian mystic, and but Kandinsky really felt that it didn't matter if it was Christian or not. It's just that the spirit was the thing that was going to save us. So it's a very hopeful and very idealistic sort of thing. And he said, if we don't learn, if we don't embrace the spiritual, and art, is the expression of that, then we're doomed. And in fact, a few years later was the First World War, which is the worst war that had ever happened in Europe or any place in the world. And very few people understood what was going on in the First World War. So it was a particularly senseless war. Second World War, there were clear bad guys. We had to fight that war, right? Because we had to put down Nazi. First World War, much more murky. There's no real it's a very murky morally. And I think that's what bothered people. They're asking to give their life, and they think because the Archduke was assassinated by, it just doesn't seem like something worth sacrificing your life for. Here's über das Geistige in der Kunst, over or concerning the spiritual in art. Take a look at it. So here's his work. I always feel that he has a certain relationship to landscape, which is what he began with. And there does, in this painting, there's always that joke about, oh, they've hung my masterpiece upside down. I can't imagine hanging this upside down. It really reads kind of landscape-ish. I see hills, trees, maybe cloud forms, maybe figures of trees. It has a path almost, you see? Although I don't think he meant these things, they just kind of come out. And he said the artist doesn't really control. The less control he has, the more pure vessel he is of the spirit, then the spirit makes the painting. And he leaves the spirit vague. Right. Here's another one. He does these improvisations. He uses musical terms and then does these kind of large symphonic works from time to time, which he calls compositions, and where they're more complex. And he brings together things that he had improvised and brings them into kind of a large symphonic works. They're very commanding and very beautiful. Look at the lovely light here and the biomorphic forms and even again, I always kind of see a landscape out of his work. Oh, this is an interesting one that he painted, and then later on, he said he didn't notice this at first, but it looks like cannons blowing off, exploding from the lower right. You see kind of cannons with wheels, and then buildings toppling. And he said they were just abstract forms that they just came to him. He would walk around the painting and turn it upside down, work on it from all different things. And but this, once you see that, you really see it. And this almost looks like these little lines down by the cannons almost look like barbed wire, that would suggest the war. And this was actually painted just a few months before the opening of the war. So it's a very prescient piece and very much prophetic in the sense of, if you give up the spirit, this is what's going to happen. Franz Marc is one of my very favorites. He's one of the great animal painters of all Western culture. In the 18th and 19th century, animal painting became a whole genre of itself, people painting horses and so forth. But most of the modernists, none of the others that I know, really make that their specialty, but that's what Marc did. And he writes also beautifully that he feels animals are more in contact with nature, in contact with God, and we can learn from them how to live in society. And I'm surprised with the animal rights movement that he wouldn't be more embraced than he is, because I just find him to be one of the most lyrical and sensitive, and just look at these deer. Look at how much he understands deerness, you know? I mean, he understands how deer walk, their meekness, the sort of the way the head goes. It's really beautiful. And the tiger, and really different sort of turning around quickly like that, you know? It's really wonderful capturing. His most famous painting is Blue Horses. And here he does kind of the thing like Gainsborough does with Blue Boy, in that the back is supposed to be blue, according to tradition, and that because warm colors seem to advance, seem to come forward, and so that the Renaissance it fades into blue in the background of the Mona Lisa, for example. But here he reverses that, and of course horses aren't blue. But he was using that Novalis idea of blue as the color of the spirit, of depths, of the diapasons of the soul. I forgot to. Kandinsky does make an interesting thing. He says, I forgot to say this, but I'll put it in now. He said it's kind of like a piano, that the artist is the piano player and the keys are the colors and the forms, and they make they hit these strings, and the strings are the soul of the viewer. So for the work of art to complete the circle, it not only needs to be an expression, but it needs to be appreciated. It needs to be, ingested. And again, it's like that tree in the top and the bottom. Well, anyway, okay, here's a wonderful one, just this horse looking off, almost like a, Cuthbert of Friedrich painting. Then he goes to Paris and he sees Cubism, and he comes back with this kind of more rectilinear form, where and here they are two deer. Again, it looks like it almost could be abstract, but you look down here and you can see the form of this mother and her baby. It has spots on it. But look at the and doesn't it look like stained glass? I always think these would just be beautiful stained glass windows. And the Germans really do develop that kind of radiant color that just seems to emerge from behind the canvas almost. I just find these so exciting. Here's one called Stables, which are kind of, he uses the geometry of the stables in the barn to kind of organize the space. And it's a fairly large, for him, painting. And he was in his 30s. He also writes. He writes beautifully about animals and so forth. He's really worthwhile investigating. Here is another one. This is the deer in a monastery garden. And again, he used that monastery idea, the spirituality of it, the search for God, the search for the transcendent in the everyday, and the thing way it kind of turns as if it's listening to a celestial voice. And now you can see he's using the geometric form that he has learned from seeing Cubism in Paris. Actually, also Cubism, there were some shows of the Futurists and the Cubists in Munich. So he would have been privy to that. Here's one of the greatest masterpiece. Unfortunately, it was damaged in a fire. And you can see this portion of it on the right, that sort of the colors are dull. That's where it was damaged by smoke. And Paul Klee touched it up afterwards. So this is one of his great masterpieces called The Fate of the Animals. And there's a blue deer in the center just being shot. And you can see horses in the upper left running away, horses, blood spilling. It seems like, machine gun bullets. So it's this high tragedy of the death of the animals. And of course, it's prescient of the war. And just before, he breaks through, like Kandinsky, to complete abstraction at the very end of his life, because he dies in the first months of the war. He's drafted and bam, he's gone. And he writes letters back to Paul Klee, his buddy, who's Swiss, who is not, it's like Picasso in Paris, is Spanish. He doesn't, isn't required to be drafted. But this is called Battling Forms, and it's just these red and black forms battling. And it would have been so interesting to see how this artist would have matured as an artist and bringing this more lyrical quality to German Expressionism. It would have been interesting to see how he would have done that. I know I have to go fast now, but we're going to go through. There were some women involved with the art movement. Paula Modersohn-Becker and also Gabriele Munter. But just look at Munter briefly. This is self-portrait. With that, I love that hat. The very, she was from Munich. She looked at, where Matisse and Picasso were looking at African art, she was looking at folk art. And there was this kind of a Bavarian tradition, and Munich is the capital of Bavarian state. And but you paint on glass, you paint on the back of the glass. So the things that are most front had to be painted first, and so forth. And so she picks this up, and this is one of the paintings. And this is her and Kandinsky. She was the lover of Kandinsky. And here's her, print of Vasily. Of course, with the outbreak of the war, Kandinsky had to return to Russia, where actually he became involved with the revolutionary government and became a commissar of art before finally being exiled and returning to the Bauhaus. So we haven't heard the last of Kandinsky at all. Klee is actually my favorite artist, and I'm almost nervous about presenting to you because he's easy to kind of overlook and to underestimate. He's a miniaturist. He does these little things, and he's very interested in the art of children and the art of the insane. And there was this book that came out by Prinzhorn called Art of the Insane, and where he had worked at a mental institution and had given paint, and he was tried to categorize them. Schizophrenics do this kind of thing, and manics do this, and so forth. And so Paul Klee was very interested in that because he felt that perhaps the way that Mark felt that animals were closer to nature and closer to the spirit, Paul Klee kind of felt children and the insane. And so he has this kind of strange mystical quality, these little tiny paintings. This is called Around the Fish. And I don't know how to, a cold, dead garden with these little birds. This is a little tiny painting. Paul Klee, I've never seen a picture by Paul Klee that I didn't like. It's the only artist I can honestly say that about. I've never seen anything by him that I didn't like. And one of the reasons is Paul Klee destroyed a lot of his work. Well over half the things he did, he destroyed. So he had a very high standard. So all we really get is the cream of the crop. And they're like these little jewels of miniatures, bringing us into this fairy tale land. This one's called Hot Pursuit. And it's painted on gauze, kind of in this kind of rough gauzy thing. And then the paint is very pasty. It's a little tiny, it's at Harvard, but Hot Pursuit, I like it, with a little dog or cat there too. This is probably my favorite painting by Paul Klee, and I think really the Sphinx-like, Mona Lisa-like counterpart in 20th century art. I find it, as abstract as it is, it seems to me very deeply psychological. I really get a sense of the person's intelligent, the person that's being small-mouthed, he doesn't spoken heavily, and that eye that moves. It's intelligent, radiant, mysterious. There's a real presence there despite its abstraction. It's just a very small painting. It's called Senecio. And it's Senecio is one of the characters in Commedia dell'arte. And remember that Picasso, the Harlequin and the Pierrot, and Senecio is an old man who seems like a fool, but actually he always ends up being wise. We think that we've dismissed the old man, and then he comes up with a wise saying at the very end and ties it all together. So it's a sort of a wisdom that's hidden behind a befuddled or a childlike quality. And I think that's very much what Paul Klee is. In a way, it's maybe a very abstract self-portrait. He sees himself as that. Well, of course, the Nazis, were merciless. Paul Klee, he was associated with the German Expressionists around the Munich group, but he was Swiss. And then later he taught at the Bauhaus with Kandinsky. And then when the Nazis closed down the Bauhaus, he got a job in Dusseldorf at the academy, and then finally went back to Switzerland, where he died. And this is his last painting. It's called Death and Fire. It kind of is, kind of this skull-like thing. And it also looks like it says tot, which means dead. And so, as is the little painting, it's on like burlap. It's on, and again, that radiant fire-like quality, kind of burned into your imagination. I just, now I sometimes people get it and sometimes they don't. And I tell people this, I tell my students, my favorite artist, they go, "You're crazy. This is crazy stuff. It looks like a child did it." But I mean, boy, that's a brilliant child. And so I just think, not that they're so important, not that it had the wide spread influence like Kandinsky or Picasso had, but in its own quiet way, there are just these little polished jewels. I just absolutely love Paul Klee. Oh, we've reached an hour. We're going to do Vienna, and then well, I'm going to take another 5 minutes if you'll allow me to. Here is The Bride of the Wind by Oskar Kokoschka in Vienna. Now, of course, Austria is not, it's German-speaking land, but it's, you know, and it's really the epicenter of the First World War, because it was Austro-Hungarian Empire that was the entity that ended up being broken up after the war. This one's called Bride of the Wind, and it's a self-portrait. He's laying there with his wife, Alma, but he's not sleeping. He's awake. And I think it always reminds me of insomnia. You know, those nights where you just can't sleep, you're tossing and turning ideas, you get fears, you begin to fall asleep. And of course, these people did have financial woes and problems. It's very difficult, especially as the kind of outsider kooks on the margin of the discourse the Expressionists were taken to be. It was hard for them to eke out a living from their art. But Kokoschka has a broad, I think out of them all, he reminds me most of Rubens, or one of the great Baroque masters, because they have this kind of large Baroque grandeur, but a tragic grandeur. And you can see here again the pasty kind of quality of the brushwork. So unlike Matisse, you know, Matisse would take a brush and the paint very fluid and long lines and so forth. Here, very pasty paint. You load the brush and immediately it's run out of, you have to keep attacking and putting down more and more. It has this rough quality. And you can see its relationship to Van Gogh. I mean, this is almost like a figural version of the Starry Night, you know, swirling forms in the night. And where are they? I guess they're in bed, but they also seem to be floating over a landscape, a moonlit landscape, and perhaps the Alps in the background. Yeah, this is a self-portrait, 1917. So you can see this was made actually during the war. Very, again, the psychological depth that you could get in these. And this is the architect Adolf Loos, who wrote the book Crime and Ornament, a very important architect, and he shows them with great depth. I love the hands. You know, he does a wonderful job. Egon Schiele is another one of these people that died tragically young. He died in the flu epidemic of 1918 at the age of 28. Very strange stuff. These are self-portraits. He had this curved, his chest, he had a deformity in his chest, and where I forget the bone in the middle, that it curved instead of being straight. And instead of de-emphasizing that, he emphasizes it. You can see it here in this self-portrait. He does a lot of self-portraits. This is him and his wife and his child, all nude. You know, this wonderful linear qualities, a master draftsman. And to show himself nude with his wife and child is kind of an interesting kind of nudist colony, you know, pre-World War I thing. But one of my favorites is this painting of Franz van Gogh, who I guess was a painter, but we don't have any work by him. He was a buddy that we don't know anything about his work, but he uses it as a vehicle of the spirit, that the artist is like an electrified being who, like a radio tower, kind of takes the vibes from out there and translates them into living forms, just like Kandinsky says, that he's the medium. And I think he kind of presents Franz van Gogh as the quintessential artist, you know, as the medium, as the radio tower, as the madman, as the kind of obsessed person. The eyes are also very, very enlarged. And that nervous but perfect brushstroke. I mean, the drawing is really excellent. But it has this shaky quality that agitates the whole surface. This is one of my very favorite paintings again. And here's another one. And this is him again with death behind him. Death is stalking him. Death is the white ghostly figure, and is, you know, he's trying to embrace the artist who looks at us and seems to kind of be just one step ahead of death. He did die in the flu epidemic of 1918. at the age of 28. So it's too bad. It would have been interesting to see how Sheila would have taken his work beyond. There was a show a couple of years ago at the Neue Gallery in New York, and it was very wonderful. I want to just close with Ernst Barlach, and I'm sorry I'm going over an hour. It'd be easier for me to do a whole semester, on the German Expressionists, because I find their tragic spiritual work to be very, very inspiring. And I love their sense of mission. I love how they don't see the artist as a decorator or someone who makes like witty, charming little things, or as a macho man like the futurists, but sees the artist as a mystical vessel, sees the artist as a conduit to a higher reality, whether it be the unconscious mind or God or however you want to, the spirit, however you want to construe it, but that we must give up some of our ego in order for that to happen. Okay, so Barlach is interesting. Barlach is a sculptor. I thought I'd throw in one sculptor, and he does this wonderful singing boy. This one just before the war called The Avenger, that really seems to the fear of war, the irrationality of it, the speed of it all. And these are, bronze sculptures. He also was interested in communism. And in those days, communism, we didn't know it was going to turn into totalitarianism. So he made a couple trips to the Soviet Union, where he was cordially received, because the early Soviet government liked modern art until Stalin got in, and then the party was over. So he had these sympathies, and that made him suspect to the Nazis. And so they really persecuted him, even though his work is like really very German, nationalism. This is Katie Kollwitz, another German expression. We didn't have time to look at her, do another one on her, but she lost both her sons and her husband during the First World War, and she's a real committed pacifist. And he does this at the Güstrow Cathedral. He made a picture of her as, it's her face, but it's a hovering angel, just kind of hovering. And it's a war memorial, right, to those that lost in the First World War in this little chapel in the Güstrow Cathedral. It's really sublime. It's really beautiful. Of course, the Nazis, brought it down. Now, this is a work that I did some research on, and publication 20 years ago, but this is called the Geistkämpfer, or the struggler of the spirit warrior, the spirit fighter. And it's about 30 feet high if you go all the way to the top of the sword. It's a monumental, one of his largest works. It seems to be an angel with a sword standing over some sort of beast, some sort of submissive beast. And what I couldn't, and it has a lot of connections to early German medieval art. He's really looking at that. Works like this, what is this? The Gerald Crucifix from about 1000 AD. It's in Cologne, it's wooden, but you notice how he distorts the form almost in an expressionistic sort of manner. And Barlach is looking at this and not lost on him. And he was, it was this big thing. Well, the interesting thing is, I was raised in Minnesota, and this was out in front of the museum. So I always, ever since a little kid first went there, I've always seen this piece. And one of the things in the back is there are marks because the Nazis really hated the sculpture. It was put up, some Nazis bent the sword and broke it, and he had to repair it. Then other ones spray painted swastikas on it and had to be removed. Finally, the Nazis cut it up into pieces and were going to melt it down. And but then they got other things to do, losing the war, and it was brought together and reassembled. But it has this, it has these marks on the back. It's really, it's like cross-shaped marks. They cut it in four, and it almost seems like an unintentional revelation, kind of like the suffering and the cross. And I don't know, he didn't mean it that way, but it's hard when you walk around the back and you see those saw marks. You just realize, like, this piece just barely made it. Then what I was curious about when I was looking at this, I thought, like, why do they object to this one so much? What was it about this particular one? It's an angel and a beast. It's usually interpreted as the ego or the intelligent, rational mind taming the more bestial aspects of our id, represented by that, whatever it is, a wolf with its tail between its legs, right, to show its submissiveness. And it's still growling, but the angel definitely has the upper hand. And so I said, it's a very German. Why didn't they, why was this particular one that got him in so much trouble. And then I found out that it was like the other, a war memorial. And this was in Kiel, a northern a port of the North Sea. And it was there that the High Command at the end of the First World War ordered a suicide mission of this fleet. They told them to attack the British, and the British would have destroyed them. But it was kind of a grand, last, crazy gesture. At the very moment when people were trying to negotiate out the peace, the High Command was ordering a suicide mission, and the sailors did not go along. They said, "We've been through enough of this." They arrested the commanding officers. They tried them on board the ship and hung them. And they took down the German flag and they put up the red hammer and sickle, and they said, "We are the Soviet of sailors," inspired by the Russians' revolution of just a year earlier. We refuse to fight any longer in this insane, crazy war. And they stood up to it. So the Kaiser, of course, was upset because here we have a mutiny on our hands. And it wasn't just Kiel, it spread to other ports in the North Sea. So there was this whole bunch of communist sailors who at the very end of the war were threatening the government. So the Kaiser sent out a battalion of the National Guard to put down the mutiny, and instead they fraternized with the sailors. They turned around and they marched on Berlin. The Kaiser fled to the Netherlands, and it was the end of the Second Reich. And then the communists occupied Berlin, and they wanted to move it toward communism. So the committee that had been put together to write a constitution went to Weimar, which is not as hot as Berlin, occupied by communist sailors. So you see, this was a memorial, and this is my contribution to it. It might have, here, let me show you something else. Okay, so there's the wolf. It looks like the she-wolf of Rome. And the she-wolf of Rome was on the banknote to like 1,000 lira in Italy. And this was a sculpture that Mussolini had acquired and then given to the Capitoline Museum. And it was on currency, so it was really well known. The she-wolf, it's an Etruscan, pre-Roman, piece, and it looks kind of expressionistic. And here again, this. So I think what it symbolized in the artist's mind, and also to the Nazis, was this is a symbol of the rebellion. This is a symbol of standing up against fascism, taming the beast, making its tail between its legs. A direct quote from contemporary Italian fascism. And that the warrior of the spirit is not the warrior of the Allies, it's the warrior against fascism, against the monstrous kind of cancer and of course, the Nazis were very much against the communists. So this was all seen as hopeless stuff. They did a thing where they broke all the windows in his studio, and he suffered a great deal, but actually did outlive the war by a few years. And then this was discovered later. Well, that's about what I have for today. I'm sorry I went over. I just got so excited I couldn't stop